keep on, keep on, keep on running, keep on running, and I'm gonna keep on, keep on, keep on, keep on, keep on running, keep on running.
Hello and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. Welcome to OWASP Ottawa's first meetup of the 2021 year. My name is Garth. I'm one of the volunteers at OWASP Ottawa, and I'm very, very pleased to introduce to you our talks for this evening. This year, we're very, very fortunate to have Dr. Gordon Josephson join us to discuss questions that we had in a survey last fall on stress and mental health. So we're very, very happy to have him with us this evening. And hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Glad to be here. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Why don't you introduce yourself and start your presentation.
Sounds good. My week is filled with one-on-one connections, either through the video or phone. So this is a unique experience for me to be presenting to a group through video. So let me share my slides with you all. Okay. So, OWASP presentation, stress and mental health. I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. I am a psychologist in full-time practice here in Ottawa. I am registered with the Ontario College of Psychologists and have been since 2005. I graduated from the University of Ottawa in 2004 with the clinical psychology degree. And before that, I did work in the federal government for a while before doing that graduate training. And in addition to clinical psychology, I have a particular interest in health psychology and in supporting what could be called mental and physical fitness. We talk a lot more about physical fitness than we do perhaps about mental fitness. But I hope by the end of the presentation tonight, you'll have a sense of what I mean by that. If you wish to contact me, I do have a website for the group I'm with, and that is just at the bottom of the slide there. So before I begin, let me just, in regards to conflict of interest, I'm going to mention a few resources, and I have no profits from the sale of those resources, so just that you're aware. As Garth mentioned, last fall he had contacted me and asked about a presentation, and I suggested a brief survey just to get a sense of what the topics of interest would be. And so my talk tonight is on the responses to that survey. The two most mentioned things with regards to mental health were stress and stress management, or responding to feeling stressed, and the topic of burnout, which really in many ways relates to stress, because it's what happens when we don't manage stress and we're in situations where we can't manage how stressed we are. So that'll be the focus of my talk. I did want to mention some very interesting questions that were raised in that brief survey that could be possible future presentations. The area of criminology or forensic psychology, there were questions around understanding criminal behavior, the people who are involved in trying to do the things you're trying to stop them from doing. Also around in the area of industrial or organizational psychology, there were a few questions around just organizational issues like managing other people or negotiating wages and that kind of thing. And then lastly, the area of motivational science. There were some questions around trying to motivate compliance with security protocols. And so I thought I'd just flag that for you. It could be a very interesting presentation. There are lots of people studying, not just psychologists in motivational psychology, but other cognitive scientists as well. So the agenda for this evening, about 30 minutes, I thought I would present on these two topics of stress management and burnout that were the main questions that were raised. And then I wanted to leave a lot of time to respond to questions that might arise in the course of the evening. At any point in the first part, if there's a question of clarification, something on the slide that you want me to speak to, feel free to type that out to Garth and he'll just interject and ask me. Otherwise, we'll leave that time at the end for other kinds of questions or comments on what was said. Great, so stress management. I'm going to be using a lot of information from this workbook, and I use this with clients a lot in sessions as well. It's a great little resource on managing stress, and also on the concept of relaxation, which of course we think of as the opposite of stress. And a lot of the topics covered in the workbook will be things I touch on when I talk about stress management. Another resource that I use, it's a bit dated at this point. Some of the information on nutrition would be probably not what they're advising today, but I like it. It's a nice format, and it's easy to pick up and grab little bits of pieces from. So both of these are available probably online, but certainly in bookstores. So let me define stress. Any change to which you need to adapt. And a lot of people talk about stress as both negative stress, difficult things, and positive stress. I prefer to use the term excitement for positive stress. And so what I'm talking about tonight is not the exciting, thrilling kinds of moments in life. These are more the difficult ones that are leaving people feeling more down. I like to start any discussion of stress with a distinction between stressors and stress. So stressors are the events or the conditions acting on us. And you can think of stress as then what is happening inside of us, the reaction to that event. And sometimes we can manage our stress by simply changing a stressor. We can try to remove one from our lives or minimize one, but sometimes we can't. Sometimes the thing stressing us, we have no control or influence over. And so then our only option is to look at trying to manage our response to it, or the stress that we're experiencing. So some symptoms of excessive stress. Often stress affects us mentally. Our concentration can be poor. It can affect us emotionally. We can be irritable or restless. We can have physical symptoms of stress, certainly muscle tension, the neck and the shoulders in particular. Fatigue, headaches related to muscle tension sometimes can also be related to stress. And what we're calling behavioral symptoms, so actions that we might end up experiencing or engaging in. So yelling or crying or turning to substances more. It's important to notice that before you start treating symptoms as coming from stress and think of them as something to address by looking at stress, it's good to go to your family doctor, of course, or go online to your family doctor perhaps nowadays, and just ensure that what you're experiencing is best addressed as stress management. There are situations like malfunctioning thyroids that can cause many of these types of symptoms that we might think of as psychological stress. So what's happening in the nervous system when we're stressed? A lot of people actually define stress as what's happening in the nervous system. And we know that our nervous system, when it perceives danger, will very quickly move into a fight or flight response. And I'm sure that's a term you're familiar with. It's marked by changes in increases in heart rate, in blood pressure, breathing rate, certainly in muscle tension. Blood is directed away from digestion and the internal processes towards those large muscle groups that are going to help us either fight or flee. And breathing becomes shallow and rapid in order to really oxygenate those muscles. It's a natural thing to happen. If there's a bear in the room and I need to get away, or a tiger or some predator, it's a very adaptive thing to happen because I'm energized. I have lots of muscle mass ready to go. However, our stresses today are often not wildlife trying to have us for breakfast. They are more chronic and ongoing, not life-threatening, and yet the body still responds with this perception of danger by activating this part of the nervous system. The opposite of a fight or flight is sometimes called a rest and digest, or you might more commonly hear it as the relaxation response. It seems almost unbelievable that, say, in the early 70s, they hadn't even mapped all this out physiologically and understood it, but certainly we do now and have for some decades, that the nervous system, when relaxed, the opposite happens. So breathing can become deep and slower, heart rate slows, muscle tension is reduced, and blood goes back to things like the digestive system, which is why we're calling it rest and digest. So a lot of what we're doing to try and manage stress is to notice when the nervous system is pulled into fight or flight and try to encourage it back into a more relaxed state. The most effective way to do that will differ for different people. So it's important to have a sort of a toolkit of different options and be aware of different things that you could do to try and help yourself with stress. Yeah, it'll differ by not just person, but also situation. So I'm going to run over some techniques or approaches for encouraging a relaxation response. These are often things I'll teach people in session and give them recordings to go away with and practice. You can get lots of recordings available online. If you would just do a search on any one of these terms, you'll find there are lots of people who have tracks up on the web to listen to. One of the simplest is the first one, body scan. It's simple in that it doesn't really look like you're doing anything. So in some ways you can do it anytime, anywhere, as long as no one needs your attention. So what you're doing is putting your mental focus on your body, being aware of any sensations or lack of sensation. There may not be a lot going on. Starting at the feet, starting at the right foot or left foot, and then moving up each leg, finishing by going through the core, down the arms, and up to the head. And so it's a mental exercise because it's really just using your focus of attention and resting it on a part of the body. It can do some important and nice things pretty quickly, and that is because you're noticing something that your toes were always there, your foot was there, you just weren't paying attention to it. But when you place your mind on it, your mind can no longer run around with a bunch of thoughts. And by pulling the mind out of all the thinking that we tend to do, especially when we're stressed, the thinking become quite fast-paced. We're doing something immediately just by shifting that focus to the body. And also it can be helpful, something like a body scan can be helpful to getting in touch with where is your stress in your body. A lot of people might have a lot of stress in the body but not even be aware of it. So something like a body scan exercise helps you to get in touch with that more. The second one, also quite simple. It's called belly breathing or anxiety breathing. Sometimes it's called diaphragm breathing. We're breathing anyway. We're always breathing. That's for sure. And so it's what we're doing is paying attention to the breathing. We're not just letting it happen unattended. We're making a conscious effort to change perhaps the way we're breathing. So in that fight or flight, it talked about rapid and shallow breathing. So by thinking of the belly and by thinking of drawing air deep, not necessarily a big breath, it's a deep breath. So you're trying to relax the abdominal wall, allow the belly to rise as you breathe in and deep, and then breathe out from the belly. When you do that consciously, you manipulate your breath in that way, your nervous system picks up on it, and it realizes, well, or it imagines, I guess we're not in danger because look at the way we're breathing. And so it's a way of kind of overriding the fight or flight response by going into and manipulating the depth of the breathing. The next one is the same, the third one, progressive muscle relaxation. Breathing and muscle tension are two things that will happen unconsciously. I don't have to think about it, but I can think about it. I can draw it into my conscious awareness. And so if I choose to first tighten a set of muscles, the shoulders are a good one, squeeze them up to the ears, and then choose to do the opposite of that and let that tension go, I can reduce the amount of muscle tension in the body. And again, the nervous system picks up on the fact that that's happening, and it interprets it as a change in the context, a change in the environment, a lack of stress, a lack of something stressing you. So again, it's a nice way to override the system is by manipulating muscle tension consciously. The tightening is meant simply to be gentle. It's meant to just kind of cue the mind to know, oh yeah, right, that's when the muscle is tight, that's what it's like. And then the relaxing is what really you're heading for. Some progressive muscle relaxations can be just relax, relax the toes, relax the feet, relax the lower leg. But this tightening first and then relaxing tends to get people a better mental training on understanding their tension and how to let it go. The next one, meditation. You hear a lot about meditation these days, and it can mean a lot of things, but in general, it simply means playing with where you're placing your attention. And I say playing deliberately because it is best done not too seriously. It's best done with a very gentle and light kind of approach. Noticing, usually the mind is rested or attempting to rest in a particular focal point. So it could be a phrase, it could be a sensation in the body. The breath is a common place to meditate. So people will focus their attention or attempt to focus their attention on the sensation of breathing in and breathing out. It could be sound. It could be a sound in the environment or just any sound that comes in the environment, just paying attention to sound. It could be the taste of a cup of tea and just paying attention to the drinking and the tasting. So it's any focal point. And then the attempt, that's why they often call it a practice of meditation, is to rest the tension in that focal point and then notice when it doesn't want to rest there anymore, when it bounces around, because of course it will. Some people will say, I can't meditate, or I tried and I couldn't do it. But I think it's important to keep in mind, it's not about having a clear mind or having a clear focus. It's about trying to have a clear focus. And in the act of trying and losing the focus and trying again and losing the focus, again, with a very gentle and friendly approach, that is where the value is. The value in that it cues a relaxation response in the body. It actually changes brainwave patterns, but it also we can gain some insight into where is our mind continually jumping to, right? So if I'm trying to rest my awareness on my breath and 2 breaths later, I'm gone. I'm thinking about something. I'm planning. I'm striving to achieve. I'm sorting something out. I'm revisiting an argument that I had in my mind. And then I come back. I notice at some point, that's what's happening. I come back to my breath. Off I go again. Seconds later, I'm back in the argument, trying to think of a better thing I could have said. The fact that I'm doing that, paying attention to where my attention is the key thing that a meditation often gives us, because then we understand better what's going on in the mind. So it is a relaxation exercise. It's a lot more than that, but it can be used to relax. The last one here, visualization. It's a technique where you use your imagination, which can be quite powerful, to imagine being in a place that is calm and relaxing and safe. And it's often our imagination that is getting us more stressed because we're imagining difficult scenarios. So if we purposefully take a moment and imagine relaxing, calm, safe environment, a lot of people go to the beach in their mind. They remember a favorite place on a holiday, or they create a place that they've never been, but they can imagine it. And your nervous system will respond to that as if you were there. If you are, we often will build this up. So we'll get the person see the place in your mind with your visual mind's eye. Now ask yourself, what do you hear in this environment? Are there sounds that you can recall or that you want to imagine happening? What do you feel on your face, on your skin? Is there breeze? Is there sun? What do you taste? What do you smell? And so you kind of layer it up with the different senses, and you build up a sense of being in this place. And the body does respond as if you were there in many ways, at least in cueing you to relax. So that's some of the techniques that people can try out, and as I said, there's a lot of information on the web about them. It's important to notice that how stressed we get is related to not just the amount of danger, but our perception of the amount of danger or the amount of a problem, as well as our perception of whether we have what it will take to cope with that problem. And so our self-talk or our thinking, our beliefs about ourselves or the world have a lot to do with stress and our reaction to situations. And so for that reason, we often will talk about unhelpful thinking styles. This is sort of a standard cognitive therapy intervention. It's often used in the treatment of depression or anxiety. And it's to try to get us to understand how our thinking is creating more distress and discomfort for us. It's not meant to blame us, because of course the thoughts that run through our minds aren't really necessarily things we're choosing. Thoughts occur, they just arise often. But we can notice them and interject and change them. And so I'll go through these. You may have seen them, but you may not have. So there are these classic styles that we know most of us are prone to when we're stressed or sad or anxious, anxious being much like stress. We will do a lot more of them, unfortunately, because they will create more distress for us. So an all or nothing style of thinking is just what it says, that psychological concepts, often interpersonal concepts, these things are rarely all or nothing. They're usually on a gradient, and they're usually, the truth exists somewhere between the two extremes. However, our minds like to take shortcuts, and they like to make things either all or nothing. And if you're noticing you're talking in terms of a stressor being all or nothing, then it's a cue to wonder, really, is that true about this situation? Overgeneralizing, catastrophizing is a type of overgeneralizing. This is when something difficult is happening, for sure, it's not imagined, but in our mind, we make it more than it is. We exaggerate it. And so it's often helpful, you'll hear cognitive therapists often talking about, look for the evidence, stop and ask yourself, so how do I know this to be true? Or, I'm having this thought, but is it supported by real evidence? negative filters or disqualifying positives. When stressed, we have a tendency to filter our perceptions. We're always filtering our perceptions, but when we're down, we tend to be more aware of the evidence to suggest things should be down. And when we're in a good mood, we tend to see the more positive and happy things. So unfortunately, when we're stressed, we might start being more prone to letting that information in our filters. And if a positive idea comes in, we might disqualify it as irrelevant or unimportant. And that, unfortunately, would just make our situation worse. So looking for a thinking pattern of filtering things with a negative bias and letting those in more, or disqualifying things that have a positive nature, that can be important to do. Mind reading and fortune telling. So if we do this all the time, we think we know what someone's thinking from the face, from the expression, something, or we make predictions about the future. Of course we do, but we do it often to our own demise, in that if half the time we thought, well, that person's thinking very positive things, and half the time we thought that person's thinking negative things, we'd probably come out even. But we tend to, especially when stressed or down, we have a bias. So we're mind reading in a negative direction, or we're predicting the future in a negative context or a negative direction. So we try to draw people's attention to when they're doing this and how it's making them feel, and try to get them to do less of it. Emotional reasoning is, again, just what it sounds like. If I'm feeling worried, feeling anxious, I'm in the emotion of anxiety, and I think, well, this must be going to go badly because look how anxious I'm feeling. So I'm using my feeling to sort of reason as to how something might go, and yet how I'm feeling might have nothing to do with how it actually will go, or anything about how it's going to go. Unfair comparisons are things like comparing yourself to another person and seeing how they're doing something well and thinking, well, how come I'm not? But in fact, their context is completely different than yours, and so it's not really fair to you to be even making that comparison. Of course, we're social animals. We exist in social groups. We want to be aware of each other, and we pay attention to each other. So of course we compare, but unfortunately, again, if we're stressed or down, we tend to do more unfair comparisons, which puts us further into stress or feeling down. And just a mention of worry, it's an important area. It's a type of thinking, worrisome thinking. You can imagine it has a lot to do with stress and being stressed. One of the interventions that we often suggest to people is, if the mind is worrying a lot, try to schedule a time during the day and say, okay, that's my time. Right before lunch, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to type out my thoughts, my worries. I'll do it for 10 minutes. And then the advantage is at any other time in the day or night, if you're trying to sleep, is to suggest to the mind that it postpones until the worry time. So it's a more effective strategy than trying to stop a certain type of thought or stop yourself from worrying. If you say, oh, no, not right now, look, there's a time for that, we'll do it tomorrow right before lunch, and then you make the point of doing it, you sit down and write out or type out some of the things that are on your mind, it tends to be effective in trying to calm down a mind that's busy with worry. The other thing under this bullet is just that worrying is not planning. So when we're thinking about a future or a potential future, we could plan for it. We could sit down and type out a plan. If this happens, I'll do this, and then this will, we'll proceed in this way. Worrying is not that. It's kind of ruminating. You're not taking the time to sit down and make a plan. It's just you're coming back to the same thought again and again. So it's really not productive thinking, worrying. Some people think, well, my worry is helping me. It's keeping me aware of what could go wrong. Not really. If you want to be thinking in a way that helps you, plan for contingencies. But worrying itself just leads to distress and to stress in the nervous system. Yeah. So some things on self-care. Most things on stress management touch on self-care, things like nutrition. and monitoring stimulants and consumption of substances. Physical exercise, of course, lots of research on how the benefit of physical exercise is first mental, not physical. Of course, if we exercise a lot, our bodies will respond, but within seconds, our minds will respond, our brains will respond. And so exercising for your mental health, your mental fitness is very helpful. It's very helpful in reducing stress. Social support and social connection, that's a tough one right now. It's unfortunate that they decided to call it social distancing and not physical distancing. You've probably heard both terms, but as a psychologist, I really thought it's physical distancing that we're looking for, in that this is a virus, likely mostly respiratory, so it's the air and the moisture that I exhale that's going to bring it to someone else or them to me. So we need to limit physical or use a barrier like a mask, but we don't need to limit our socializing in the sense of our chatting with friends, visiting with friends, talking with people, because that has a huge impact on our sense of support and feeling calm and feeling connected. So as much as possible, I know letter writing is making a comeback, I hear, but even just sending a friend a text or an email can be a nice way to try and keep that social support going, even though things are clearly different right now. Sleep, the problem with something like COVID-19 and working from home, a lot of people's routines, and of course all the changes in childcare, a lot of people's routines got messed around. We know that sleep is best if you get up at the same time every day of the week, including weekends. That is going to give you the best quality of sleep. It's much like nutrition. Nutrition kind of got messed around when people were all of a sudden working from home and desiring more comfort foods as well. And the last part on self-care is sort of hobbies or activities that bring pleasure. That's an important area. So some information on burnout, not as much as on stress management, but as you can see, burnout really is sort of the outcome of stress management that wasn't effective. In fact, the World Health Organization defines burnout on the job as chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed by the individual or by the organization. It's not blaming the person necessarily. It could be an organizational failing. It's characterized as feeling depleted or exhausted, increasing your mental distance from the job, or feelings like negativity, pessimism, cynicism, and a sense of ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment. It's not necessarily an objective ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment, but certainly feeling that way. So certainly it affects attitudes around work. Burnout was mentioned by several of you in the brief quiz or questionnaire survey. It's not a mental health diagnosis. Usually if someone has experienced what we would commonly call burnout, the diagnosis has to do with more with mood challenge, mood disorder, like depression or an anxiety problem. But certainly it's used in organizations and people talk about feeling burned out or fearing that they'll burn out. It can definitely lead to increased dissatisfaction and absenteeism, inefficiency in the actual work that's being done. It's not just excessive amounts of work, it's also how you feel about the work you're doing. Do you feel like you have some influence over how things are happening? Do you feel you have the right tools and the right context? Are you in interpersonal conflict with others or feeling not part of the group? All of those things can affect a feeling of burnout. So avoiding burnout, try to say no. That's simple to say and hard to do, I know, but sometimes it's the organization that's making it very hard to say no, but sometimes we're doing it to ourselves because there's this aspect of personality that doesn't want to say no or delegate. So it's interesting to just play with the concepts. What's stopping that from happening if it's not happening? Of course, practice the the self-care and stress management techniques that I was talking about earlier. And sometimes it requires modifying the work, taking time off of work, or even changing the job to another role. Often we can be quite stressed and burned out from a particular task or role, but if we shifted to another one, we would have more energy and feel more vitalized or invigorated. So I just wanted to leave you with this link to the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. They have specific information on dealing with the stress of COVID-19. Anything that I spoke about already is going to be applied. We can think of COVID-19 as just a type of stressor, and the changes to our lives are stressors that we're now stressed by. So, of course, when the context changes, when you're at work, at home, and there are perhaps children and you're homeschooling, and we're reluctant to change our expectations on ourselves. We want to always sort of keep performing in the same way, but expectations, which are mental constructs that we have and carry around, they have a huge role on our mental health. So if the context changes, if there's a harder to get things done, then if the expectation changes as well, it can be helpful. Of course, the challenge is having the employer change their expectations, and some employers are better at that than others. I would make a suggestion that take the information I presented and pick one or two things, one or two strategies that you think might be interesting or useful to you, and make a plan to implement them. One way to motivate yourself to do that is to think of all the benefits or the pros of doing that. And also another great way to motivate ourselves is to enlist the support of family or friends who are aware that we're trying to do this and might encourage or share, engage in it with you. So thank you. That is what I have. I have a few other things I can talk about if there aren't questions, but I think it's probably good to open it up to questions now. My contact information is there again. The College of Psychologists of Ontario website. One can search any region of the province, and under different languages, different age groups, different sort of characteristics that you might be interested in getting help from. Registered mental health therapists. As well, I just wanted to remind people, many organizations have employee assistance programs where there is someone to speak to about stress or a fear of burnout. And it's often in-house in the sense that you don't pay out of pocket for employee assistance programs, that is. Not for registered psychologists. Most you need to pay and then it's refunded to you by your insurance if you have. Yeah. And then just to mention, the Distress Center of Ottawa has a website and a phone number. So yeah, let me leave it at that and see if there are any questions that Garth's aware of.
Just looking at the chat, I'm not seeing anything currently, so just a reminder that if you have any additional questions, you can add them quickly to the chat. While we're waiting, I'll just ask a question, thinking out loud, is with COVID and being in more or less lockdown since March, I'm wondering if you're noticing people having very different sleep patterns. I've noticed my sleep patterns are all over the place and they're not really consistent, and I don't feel particularly stressed. It's not right in front of me. I'm very fortunate. I was working at home even before the pandemic, consistent employment, a roof over my head that's not leaking, a shirt on my back, all the fundamentals are there. We all have our health, and yet there I am, wide awake at 3 a.m.
Yeah. So if you're not wide awake because you're feeling stressed, you're aware of tension in the body or rapid thoughts in the mind, then it's always good to ask yourself different questions. So has my coffee habit changed at all? Do I drink coffee? And because maybe I'm around the machine more now, a simple thing like increasing our caffeine, seems simple enough because coffee is a pretty widely available substance. It can definitely affect our sleep. So just to ask yourself, what about my routine might have changed? And could that have something to do with it? Of course, if, there's so many things about our routines that could have changed when March occurred. Maybe in the summer, I don't know if you felt it got better, but the summer, I think things got a little bit more normal and that people were moving about a bit more. But certainly now they're back into a less regular kind of routine, especially when the kids were sent home from school in early January, or for the month of January. So it's hard to say. There are lots of reasons why sleep is disrupted. It could be simply not getting up at the same time. That is, the sleep experts say that is the number one thing to do. Set that alarm in every day of the week up at the same time, so that because we experience rhythms. This is a part of being an animal. We forget that we're part of the animal world. So we definitely have internal rhythms and clocks. They definitely are affected by when we went to bed and mostly by when we got up. So yeah.
So there's no questions yet in the chat. So I didn't know if you had some questions that you could go through. But before you do, I just have one more question.
Sure.
I have a number of family members, cousins, aunts, uncles that seem to be a class warrior, and maybe that's helped me be a great threat modeler in my industry, because I worry for my customer or my client or my employer's security posture, and that goes into a threat model. Do you find that sort of remains within families, within a family tree, or is it something else?
Well, certainly our temperaments are biological, so they're from birth, and that's just the genetic inheritance of the structure of our brain determines if we're the baby in the crib that heard everything and reacted, or we were the baby in the crib that kind of slept through everything. So there is a biological or temperament element to anxiety and to worry. So some of that's genetic, but it's also very much modeling. So if we grow up in a family where people are worried about a lot of things and drawing our attention to this could happen, that could happen. So we're sort of taught at a young age to kind of model that behavior and also become worrisome. So it's hard to distinguish how much is genetic and how much is environment. But yeah, I think worry can definitely take away. I mean, it can be an asset in the sense that you're right. Anyone who's involved in planning for what could go wrong, a mind that generates a lot of ideas about what could go wrong, this is an asset. This is important. It's just you want to be able to turn it off when you no longer want to be in that headspace. But,
yeah, that's what I'm still trying to figure out. We do have a question in the chat. Ophelia asks, do you have any recommended resources for helping others deal with grief, children and adults both?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is in Ottawa, there is the Ottawa Bereavement Society, or I forget the exact term, but if you Googled it, it would come up likely. They, in times of non-pandemic, they had in-person grief support groups, which could be very occasional or very informal. You could just show up on if you wanted to. And I know they did go online with a lot of their groups, but I don't know exactly what their frequency is now that they're not meeting in person. But I do think meeting with others who are going through similar grief can be a helpful thing to people, because often grief is a thing that we don't talk about unless we're going through it, and there can be some sort of social pressure not to get too much into it with others. So I'd recommend that organization. Here in Ottawa, I know it to be quite strong. I'm not sure about other cities in the province.
I see something called Bereaved Families of Ottawa.
Yeah, that would be it. Yeah.
Right. So that's it for that question. I'll let you get on to the questions you had on hand.
Yeah, just another thought to that question, though. There is a wonderful little book. It's on my shelf. it's a series of books, cartoon books about dinosaurs, and it explains death and dying for children. And I think it's when dinosaurs die, or I have to look at my shelf, turn my head to you all. It's a lovely little book that really is a great way to be able to sit with a child and talk to them about what's happened in a way that I think is quite effective. And I've had clients use the book with their children, and they've given me good feedback about it. When Dinosaurs Die, I believe. There's also When Dinosaurs Divorce. So I know there's the two. Again, a difficult thing that can happen that one might want to help children with. And so this animated children's book is, I think, well done. One of the things I was going to mention, because it was one of the questions, I didn't know if I'd have time, is there was a question about perfectionism and how that might relate to stress and how that might relate to burnout. So of course, it's not going to be good for stress or burnout, right? If you're operating in a mindset that says everything must be done perfectly, and your own internal standards surpass what is actually necessary or needed, then you're going to create a lot more work and a lot more stress. The opportunity for something to go wrong is a lot higher if I'm trying to make it 99% right. So perfectionism is definitely, you can think of it as a personality style or just a mental habit, but it can be problematic for stress. And there are some good books on perfectionism. The one I often recommend to clients, I think it's called Perfect No More. When Perfect Isn't Good Enough, done by a Canadian author, is a good one to pick up and read, because certainly you're not doing yourself any favors if you're holding yourself to a standard that you don't need to.
That sounds like a title for a country and western song.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? Yeah. The other area there were some questions about was just what they're now calling COVID-19 phobia. So it's more than just feeling stressed about it and stressed about all the extra things that are happening and need to be attended to. It's where a person's quite anxious and feeling a lot of intense physical anxiety about the idea of catching COVID-19 or the idea of transmitting it to someone else. And it seems to be more prevalent in people who were subject to anxiety prior to the pandemic. That makes sense. Especially a type of anxiety we call obsessive compulsive anxiety, where there's a lot of obsessing around worrisome thoughts, things that could go bad, and then actions to try and make yourself feel better, which they call compulsions. So hand washing, there was a question in the survey about what do you do if a family member is just constantly hand washing. So it's a tricky one, because of course hand washing can be a problem in just a health anxiety in general, and we usually try to get people not to wash their hands to realize that they're going to be okay. Of course, in this context, public health is recommending hand washing. So it's about how often and for what purpose. So once washed well with soap, one does not need to wash again. So that drive to repeat the behavior and which we think is going to make us safer or make us feel safer, is actually not helpful, because it's just keeping us locked in that in the anxiety, the obsessive thought about the perceived danger. So these kinds of things, it's probably worth important to talk to your family doctor if someone's going through that kind of where they're taking the precautions way over. They're not leaving their room. They're not even willing to step outdoors. That's a sign that their anxiety about the situation has really become quite debilitating. And so there were some questions about that and what to do about it. Yeah, of course, any of the things I spoke about, any of the stress management or relaxation response inducing kinds of actions or activities or changing the thinking are all going to help with that kind of extreme health anxiety. Yeah. I think that was all the questions from the quiz that were related to mental health and I don't know if anyone listening recalls one they typed that they didn't hear me talk about and wanted me to.
Well, maybe what we can do is we can put out the offer is that if there are any further questions, we can pass them on. And, you know, if possible, have a follow-up session in some subsequent months.
Certainly, yeah.
And we can always hope to, at some point in time in the future, have you live in front of an audience.
That would be interesting. I much prefer to talk when I can see the people I'm talking to. So this has been an interesting opportunity for me to see what this is like to talk into the camera. The other thing I could briefly mention was just prioritizing self-care, because that I did mention self-care, but that was also one of the questions was, you know, clearly people in the quiz were saying it's hard to find the time. Our days are full. And so I do think the idea of really trying to think through the benefits kind of weighs up the advantage of taking away from something else in order to take time for self-care. So if we really think about how we might be functioning, how we might be feeling, how we might be relating to the people around us better if we did more to manage stress and have more moments of relaxation, there's good motivation there to want to try and put in the time and energy, find the time and energy. Yeah. So yeah, that would be all then.
Awesome. I really appreciate you talking to us this evening. It's off our beaten path, but it's a subject that many in the audience will recognize as the unspoken thing that we all face. So I really appreciate you coming to speak to us this evening. We're very fortunate to have you, and we'll look forward to hopefully having some follow-up meetups either in front of the camera or more hopefully in live and in person in 2021. So thank you again for joining us.
You're most welcome. Have a good evening.
Awesome. So next up, we're very, very fortunate to add a previous speaker to OWASP Ottawa. If you're like me, you've worked on many different types of Appsec programs, and you've sometimes wondered, how are we doing? Where are we going? How fast are we getting there? And how do we measure this? So we're very fortunate to have Ophelia Chan talk to us this evening about Appsec reporting metrics for Appsec programs and vulnerability management. Welcome.
Hi, thanks, Garth. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you virtually again, I guess, and thank you for attending.
Yeah, no dubious train service.
That was an adventure, yes. 1 second, let me share my screen so that we can at least confirm you can see the deck. Awesome. And then I do want to just mention while I'm doing this talk that I do talk through the whole thing, but feel free to interject. I will pause occasionally to ask you if you have any questions. Please feel free to add them into the comments and when you think that it's relevant and so on and so forth. I do like to be interrupted, and I will take heckling as well. That's one of the entertaining parts about being a speaker in person that I really miss while doing things virtually. So let me just start with this. And the entire talk is prefaced on this kind of situation, which I do somewhat encounter in real life. And my tagline for this entire presentation is really, metrics. Intelligent ones can really help you, and poorly thought out ones can be one of the main sources of really, really bad behavior, confusion, unhappiness, and systemic dissent inside of an organization. So I built this talk based on some of the experience that I have just working through methodologies on my own to try to figure out how would I build out just some basic things for clients to start them down the right path of doing metrics and reporting properly. Okay, I won't go into who I am too much. The TLDR is that I'm a security brain for hire with a specialty in Appsec interpretive dance. I've spent a lot of time in software security related vulnerability management. So a lot of what you'll see today is focused on that. And feel free to reach out to me either at ophelia.chan@owasp.org, or you can usually find me on LinkedIn. I do have to give you a couple of standard disclaimers. So one is that my opinions are my opinions, and my all the different groups that I'm affiliated with are okay with letting me speak. They're nice enough to do it. So, all blame for anything that you don't like hearing is to me, and all praise to them, please. And then there are images that I use in this presentation that I borrowed from other people, and I'll credit them where I can. And then I do show a couple of products here, and I'm not advocating for any of them except for one, and I'll mention which one that is. Just they happen to be things that I know of that I've used maybe in the past, and they're just examples of things that you might want to think about. Okay, let's talk scope and objectives. I start here with everyone because metrics and reporting are really pointless and contextless without some idea of scope and objectives. So I'm going to talk a bit about that first. These are the questions I usually think hard about before I start down any particular path, and I'll suggest a bunch of things during this presentation to supplement these particular problems, but the situational awareness is important. If you're going to go down this path of doing measurement and reporting at all, right, this presupposes that you're going to actually find out what you're doing today, and you have some interest or you have some awareness of what you're doing today. So you have some idea of the personnel, the capabilities, the tooling, the process, and the drivers that you have today. And if you don't, you're going to have the commitment to find out, right? The rest is about figuring out or monitoring everything else aside from what problem you're trying to solve. So think really carefully about that one first. Okay, you hear people talk about objectives being SMART. And really, that's just answering these same questions from the previous slide, but with the SMART acronym, right? When you usually talk about, objectives for an Appsec organization or for a vulnerability management program, what you often get is this high-level mission statement. Like we're going to reduce risk by catching vulnerabilities before they make it into production, which I find is actually a pretty useless statement. And the reason why is because we're still left to actually define what we're going to do and what appropriate measures and behaviors are. And that's the part that makes, a wish list into a strategy, into a tactical plan. So when you go and define your scope and objectives for the first time, here are some of the guiding principles that I think security should be focused on. The first one is that we want to empower the organization to take easy and secure routes. Okay, that means we're going to provide them with a clear explanation of controls and requirements, and we're going to focus on building easier paths to security and reusable elements. Okay. And the second one is that we want to help the business control their own destiny. We want to look at what fundamental security controls are broken, and then we want to fix that cause. We want to fix that problem and prevent it from reoccurring. And that, if we teach the business the method by which we're doing that, then hopefully along the lines, they will learn how to control their own destiny and do something with it. Carrie Kompakis gives this very famous parenting advice. She says, prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. And I think that this applies to security. But keep in mind, you don't put a toddler who's learning to walk on a mountain path. You probably put them in some cleared carpeted area and give them a hand, some encouragement, and then go from there, right? So if we talk through how we want to apply this concept to a security program, what we're doing is we're saying when it's young and immature, you prepare the easy paths, right? The business can walk, and then you teach them the elements that make that path safe. And eventually the program matures and they need or want to change areas to make it their own. And then at that point, you're sitting there helping them by reminding them of objectives, by maybe suggesting new ones like, hey, maybe you want to go to college, right? And then keep an eye out for them, right? You're at this point giving them advice and perspective, and then they're doing what they're going to do. And that makes a lot of sense because in application security and vulnerability management, especially, this is a people industry, right? You don't own the code, you don't own the system. It belongs to the business, it's theirs. And half the time, they don't want you to touch it, even if you could. And in the same way, a child has a life and they have to live it, right? And the parents are hopefully around to provide help and perspective and discuss and refine goals, but you have to prepare them to live that life. And so the caveat that I want to say about this particular thing that I've just said is that keep in mind that your colleagues are not children, right? And so if you treat them like that, they will not be happy, and justifiably so, right? Your colleagues are presumably contributing in their area of expertise to help the business do the thing that they're supposed to be doing. So making money and reducing risk and those types of things. So don't knock their expertise or contribution. The point of this whole analogy is that the organization is the child and security is the journey. Okay. I'm not going to go too much into maturity processes and maturity models. The point is that you're trying to get the organization through a maturity cycle, and you can refer back to any maturity cycle that you want. This one's the federal CMMC, the one that we often recommend to people as being the open source alternative is OWASP SAM. Okay, so let's talk about how you move people through a maturity cycle. It's like this, right? You watch, you agree on problems, objectives, and timelines. You teach, and you hopefully fix some of the problems ahead of time as exercises in how you should be doing it, right? Then you test, and then you maybe assess and you adjust and you do some reporting, okay? Most of the industry, I find, is stuck in this scan and fix and fighting fires stages. So that's 3 and 4 of this cycle. And fundamentally, I think it's because we approach the situation by not really considering those other options. We test and then we nag people into fixing things. And then we maybe educate them if they're lucky. And then we test again. And I want to take you through a thought exercise for a minute. Imagine you built a school system like that. Okay, first day, the kid shows up to school and they get a test, and then the teacher tells them all the things they did wrong and says, now go fix it. And next week we'll test you again. Oh, and since it's your first week, go take this annual 1-day training. That should do you for it. You're probably going to get a lot of dropouts, and they're probably going to be really angry, and they're probably going to want to go somewhere else. So what we're actually trying to do is do what we're doing in the education system, which is to educate people en masse and figure out reasonable curriculums based on their needs, set expectations, right? So this term we'll be learning these things, and hence these are the learning objectives, right? You'll have some midterm tests at these times, and we'll do finals. And then after that, we'll do report cards. We'll do, presumably figure out what we missed, what we did poorly, update the curriculum, those types of things, revise on everything that we feel that we could have done better, and then go forward from there. Having said that, most of us live in one of these two realities. If you're in a business where the business actually owns the risk and they're interested in it and they're acting on it and they get that security as theirs, then cool, awesome, congratulations. But if you're like a lot of us in the tech industry who are working for non-tech companies where InfoSec is really accountable for risk, and the business kind of nods, but they don't really close vulnerabilities and they don't have really any mandate or time for security, then keep in mind that the metrics and reporting that I'm about to talk about can be used to help you build the communications channels with people, to give you the need and the proposed business cases and action plans to negotiate what it is that other people are going to do for you and for security and by when. And then afterwards, you can use the reporting and the metrics for visibility and improvement. So here we have metrics and reporting for visibility, for proposing business cases and negotiating deals. And then if you live in that business that knows how to do that and is with you already and you have good communication channels with, then cool, you can go right to using the metrics for visibility and improvement. This is another view of the purpose of measurement and reporting in a kind of tools lifecycle. As you operate and collect data on the program you're in, you can analyze it to figure out what you're going to do later. People don't commonly review things and commonly look at metrics and reporting as part of this overall process. So I put together this diagram to give people the headspace to kind of pause and see where the metrics and the reporting fit in the context of the bigger picture. I was doing a couple of talks for students as well, and this is one of those things that they didn't really think about because they're so, at the college level, they're very focused almost strictly on the operations of tools and not the building of programs, which is where I spend most of my headspace. Okay, so we talked a little bit about metrics. Let's look deeper at what the purpose is of metrics in the larger framework. Okay, we do have metrics for situational awareness. We do have metrics for measuring progress towards objectives. We have metrics to describe what better looks like, right? We have metrics to try to plan or predict the future, and we have measurement for that too. So please try not to mix the concept of measurement, targets, and metrics together. You kind of need all three of them, but measurement is for figuring stuff out, right? So think tape measures to figure out how many centimeters something is, right? The measurements are data points, and you do actually need them, and you need to spend time on them and all those types of things, right? They're the things that will give you the data points to do other analysis that will give you interesting insights or decision-making power, right? Targets are for hitting. If you set a target and it's the wrong one, or it has no purpose, but you hit it, then what was the point? I could have used that effort elsewhere. I could have used more sleep. So targets are great, but you really have to, but those are the things that sort of say how much you want to be doing and are your ideal situations. You want to be a little bit flexible about what they end up being at the end of the day. Okay. And then metrics are the part that you actually use to assess, to compare, to track performance or production. And this is where the story and the sense making is found relative to your targets and goals. And so that's why we talk about it so much. Okay. So if we go back and we look and we ask ourselves again about what our objectives were, we're going to ask the questions of our metrics. Remember that question of how do we know we're solving the problem, right? How do we know we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing? Can we use what we're seeing to identify some areas that look funny and target them to find out more about what else we might need to solve a problem, right? To do that, you need the metrics to help you, okay? And then if you talk to change management people in this space, they're always talking about building a burning platform and collecting overwhelming data to build the pace for other people to spark change. And it starts with this measurement. It starts with metrics and the storytelling that is involved in metrics. Okay, so we'll get into it, but let's also talk briefly about reporting. There's a number of objectives about reporting. They should be displaying the metrics that you have in a way that helps you get other people to do things, show success and progress towards your objectives, and show what course of action you should do and what the consequences would be to not do that. We see this a lot in things like vulnerability management and Appsec scorecards and dashboards, the good ones anyway, right? But it's somewhat obvious to say that you should build business cases and sort of dashboards and reports that are related and targeted at the person and the people that you're reporting to and what they care about. But that's a little bit easier said than done. So we'll kind of go through some examples as well. From a tactical standpoint around metrics and reporting specifically, is that the first one that I typically tell other people when they're first doing this is that they should show their work. Okay. The more ornery and adversarial the teams that you're talking to are, the more you should show your work. And the analogy is that if you take a test and you don't show your work, you either get full marks or get 0. That's often the case with a security program too. If you go through this measurement and reporting and all these types of processes and you explain to your contemporaries, not necessarily your boss, but the people who you're working with, how you came to certain conclusions, how you're doing projections, how you're measuring success for the program, they can help you sanity check, right? You can negotiate with them on if those are the correct things, if you have misconceptions. You can have conversations to adjust your thinking, their thinking, all those types of things. Your security program or the path that you're going down then now has some initial resistance, potentially very high, but you're building consensus as you go along and you're agreeing on the way that you're going to approach things, right? And so as you're going down that path, you might get full marks or partial marks for the effort that you do, even if the situation or the program fails, but you're going to rarely fail outright without notice. Or if you do, then people will know how you got there. And so they'll be much more likely to forgive you and try again. My second guiding principle for reporting and metrics at the tactical level is that you shouldn't use unexplained numbers. And there's lots of people who go into quite a bit of detail about this, but the concept is like high, medium, low vulnerabilities mean nothing, right? Next time a new CV comes out, you're going to have tons more. So we need situational awareness. I'm not knocking that, right? But if you do have something, you better show a story about why, what quality those numbers or what decisions those numbers or what takeaway that those numbers will support in terms of future behavior. Okay, so if your problem is stalled at like the sort of shoot it now, vulnerability, this vulnerability came out through threat intel and we got to do something about it now, it's probably because you're not really giving the business enough information as part of your reporting and metrics to give them some priority and focus, right? Yes, you have to fight fires. That is a thing. But at the same time, you should be able to, for something, say, like, this isn't more important than the thing that we're already doing today. The next guiding principle is sustained effort. Let me just come to this. You should probably also always have something you're measuring or something you're trying to analyze as a next step. You're either checking your assumptions, trying to make improvements, trying to forecast something, right? So the overhead of data collection and maybe automating data collection is something you should just build into your program. And the more ornery the audience that you're dealing with, the more you need to show your work and the more time you should allocate to some sort of sustained effort towards measurement and visibility, right? People do things like say, I'll do this measurement and reporting at the end of the year. But if you want to show and collect 3 months worth of data to show something is not just a one-time thing or a one-off, but it's a trend, then it's too late if you wait until October, right? If you don't have the time built in for sustained effort, then you will never make the time. So do it. Okay. Then lastly, some progress is better than no progress, right? Getting the business to make a commitment through showing your work and modeling the system and suggesting priorities is the next step. That allows you to have the conversation with them about what they think is reasonable. Once you can get the business to make that commitment about reasonableness, you can use the reporting to show them what they agreed on, at what pace you're going to make progress, so you can see if you'll meet your mutual objectives. Otherwise, you're just going to nag them. And that's where we're stuck at a lot. And frankly, that makes my job very difficult. Okay, let's talk situational awareness. What are we doing now? What are some of the things that I might suggest that you maybe do right off the bat to get some situational awareness? This one's difficult. The point of capturing work cadence is that you need to kind of know where your time is spent and how much overhead you have so that you can use the information you have about what availability you actually have to forecast things like busy periods, how much your team can actually get done, plan the type of work they can do and when, make a case for needing headcount or doing certain types of process improvement or making specific tool purchases, and those types of program level, business level things. If you've ever built out a budget for monthly expenses, the work cadence conversation is the same, only you're not budgeting money, you're budgeting time and effort, right? So you want to find out what allocation is spent on individual pieces of your program. And then we try to apply something like the 80-20 rule, which is 80% operations and 20% strategy or future thinking analysis. And then you also kind of want to keep in mind that you probably have about 20% admin overhead in any kind of organization for things like emails and taking calls and doing annual training, vacations, that kind of thing. Heck, going to the bathroom, right? And so that doing something like a work cadence calculation allows you to see where you're really focusing your efforts and seeing if the focus is in a reasonable amount of time is spent in strategy and future thinking so that you know you're not just spinning your wheels. Okay. The other thing that's interesting about work cadence is that a lot of organizations' work is bursty. So if you look at the time you spend and when you spend the time, sometimes that can be very illuminating. Okay. At the beginning of the year until like March timeframe, which is like tax season, a lot of people do a lot of work then. And they also do a lot of work in the September and October timeframe once the kids get back to school, right? And then oftentimes they will have a moderate amount of busyness in sort of the April, May timeframe, maybe a bit of in June, and then it's dead in August and over the winter holidays because everybody's away. And so those time periods, you'll have a little bit of availability, but not a lot. And there's a lot of periods in sort of the early year when everybody is very, very, very operationally busy, right? So this is in some ways really good to know and to have confirmed because you could do things like you don't want to ask people to do things when they're already very, very operationally busy. One, that is one of the reasons why security gets this reputation for being a blocker because we don't have time and we're busy doing too many other things at the same time. But also, you know, some of it is attitude, but some of it is actually being very, very busy. So if you do find that you're very busy and the capacity of your team out is much less than what you're actually doing, but you have capacity in all the rest of the times, those super, super busy periods are great times to hire one or two contractors, right, to just supplement your team. And then summertime or places where you have some availability for some people, but not a lot of it, might be the best times for you to do analysis, might be the best time for you to plan your next education campaigns, might be the best time to work on collateral when you have time to sit there and think about things, right? And then being able to quantify things like the unplanned time that you use to fight fires allows you to either talk priorities with your boss and other stakeholders in your organization, get them to back off, or get them to give you another person. Okay, so this one I find is difficult for a lot of organizations in the consulting and like legal world. Doing this kind of time tracking is super common, right? And it's getting more and more common for things like agile teams who are doing sprint cadence and forecasting and like story points and those types of things, but it's not as common elsewhere. And so getting them into the practice is often challenging. And I often have the conversation with people and they don't really know how to do it. So if you go through the excruciating process sometimes of logging your rough time spent over a period of time on sort of different into certain work buckets, you'll get something like this graph. But what you can also do is do some time and effort estimation, which is how a lot of consulting companies scope out work. So sorry, I'll come back to this, but let me escape for a second and switch over to time and effort estimate. Okay, so let me just take you through this sheet. I put it together. This is not an actual one being used for my workplace, obviously, but I put it together for illustrative purposes. So what we do to do back of the napkin calculations on a lot of the different engagements is we start kind of here. We start with calculating what we think is our best case scenario real available FTE days. And we do that by taking 52 weeks in a year. We have 5 working days per week, and we have about 7.5 hours of working time in the perfect situation, right? We have about 2 weeks of contractual contractual vacation allotment. We have about 3 floating holidays, some LNG allowance, sick allowance, stat holidays, other allowance, and then we have some daily admin overhead, which you can get through the you can get through the work cadence calculations that you were doing, or you can use what we standardly use, which is about 20% of admin overhead in most organizations. Some you'll know your organization is a little bit top heavy or like a little bit admin heavy, and you'll up this to 30%. Right? Then you can take that and you can calculate based on that, what are your actual total FTE available hours per year? So then you can start from there. Then you move to things like fixed cost estimates for the type of work that you're doing. So you have some things you know you're going to be doing. And so you can, give a rough estimate, or your PMO can sometimes give a rough estimate of how many days you think that is going to take based on either your experience or SLAs or any of those other things. And so you can calculate them, just stick how many units there are, what you think the effort time and the elapsed time is, and then do a quick calculation of just kind of the required amount of time. Okay. But the interesting part starts when you do time and material estimates. So you take, I usually take the approach of I'll do a low and a high effort estimate for each of those things. And somewhere in that sliding scale will be the sweet spot for where we're actually going to spend time. And we can then validate individual data points and do some kind of sanity checking across the board to see how we're tracking against either our best case or worst case estimates. So what we're going to do is say, I know that I'm doing architecture reviews, right? So I know that I have, say, between 1,000 and 1,500 applications that I need to review in a year. That is, as far as I know, spread across about 15 to 20 teams. And we need to review an average of an average application, maybe 1 time a year or 2 times in a year, right? And that's across my entire portfolio. And then we'll say that means that in general, I need to do about 1,500 to 3,000 actual assessments per year in terms of architecture reviews. If I say my SLA is about 5 days, and I say that, I do a calculation of the individual things from sort of a high and a low perspective effort time, then I get how many required hours in a year I'm going to need to do that. And if I then calculate based on the available FTE days, that means I need 62 people to do that. So, and this is in the perfect case. There's no admin overhead. There's no people don't go pee. They just work all the time on architecture reviews. I need about 61 people on the high end, and about 22 people on the low end. Right? And so now you can look at your team and you can kind of go, oh, huh. I mean, 61 people is probably not very reasonable, right? 22 people is probably 3 times what I have in my team today, right? And so now we're talking it's not even possible to do this. And then we can also say okay, if I have 4 FTEs, right, then I would need to be closing about 82 assessments in a week, which is crazy, right? You can see already that it's not even remotely feasible. If I have, any number of FTEs that I want, if I actually have 61 FTEs, then they'd be closing about 5 to 6 in a week, which is maybe also juggling quite a bit in terms of architecture assessments if you think about the context switching that's required, right? So this is not feasible. You can't do this. And I think you can all agree that this isn't even doable. So now you have you now have the basis for saying, okay, where did we get these estimates from? What is the minimum viable situation in which doing an assessment no longer means anything, right? Now let's play with the numbers, not exactly play with the numbers, but negotiate on what it means to do an assessment. Or like, I need new people, guys. Like, there's no way, unless you think that we're going to do a lot fewer of them and do different prioritization, then this is not going to happen. I can already tell you right now, right? And so you can do that with a lot of your different programs. And you can do that with ad hoc things. So if you think, like, I'm going to do it like this today, or I do it like this today, and then I'm going to do it like this tomorrow, and I hope to save this much time, I can talk about, like, what do I think it's going to take to do transition? How much, like, do I think it's going to take to do this activity afterwards? And you can check your assumptions as you go in through and do it. And you can check, sanity check, right? If I needed to do this with the people that I have, how many people would I need? Or how many people would I need to do this if I was doing it today? About, a quarter, a fifth of the person's actual time if I wanted to be doing transition activities. And then I would need, a one or half a person going forward. They would need to be doing about 6 or 7 activities a week in order for me to be maintaining some kind of cadence that makes sense for me hitting my targets at the end of year. Right. So these types of things are super powerful. I hope you can see how. Right. And that all comes from just putting down your assumptions, putting down, so doing some basic calculations, and then showing your work. So let me go back to this now and go back to presentation. Okay, so we did talk about time and effort estimates. One of the other things you can do to get the lay of the land is to lay out the kind of work that you plan to do, the skills that you think you need to do it, and then ask the question of the people that are on your team, what they think about the list, and then also if they have any interest, and self-assess their knowledge in this area. And it's not perfect. It's a starting point, right? Self-assessment isn't a very objective tool, and it has its pitfalls, and I'm sure you can guess, right? But it's super easy, and it's informative, and it gives you some easy situational awareness and possible wins for making a better case for, like, learning and growth, and also for career pathing, right? If people are doing things that they're interested in, then that's always going to be better than people doing things they're not interested in, clearly. And then you can look at services you offer and see if there are cases where you have things like over-reliance on one SME who's probably drowning, and find out who on your team you could reasonably train because they have an interest, right? And then you can also see, like, is there a service that you're offering where you don't have any people who think they have any expertise in this area? Then, or you have nobody who thinks they have any expertise, and nobody who's interested, well, then you know who your next hire maybe should be. Right. So I do want to give you a caveat. The back of the napkin calculations can give you this rough estimate, but they are rough estimates, right? The models reflect your assumptions, and hopefully you can tell when you're going off track and when you need to change and fix your targets. But don't think that that's going to give you, your one source of truth. And to get a sense of why, I recommend you actually read this book. And the key points here are Brooks' Law, 1. Adding manpower to a late software project makes it later because of communication overhead and learning overhead. So the more people you add to a project, and for sufficiently large projects, there is significant overhead, and it's factorial to some degree, right? And you can see that if you've ever worked for small companies versus big companies. The communication overhead is enormous. And so if you use a simple back of the napkin calculation for something that's very, very large in a program, you're going to get significantly under-scoped work because you haven't accounted for communication overhead. And then, people take time to learn something. So if you have something due in a week, don't just add a person to it, or 10, because that won't help at all, right? And then the 2 other points that are related are that some jobs take however long they take, and it matters who you assign to a job. And the canonical example for this is in producing a baby. If you assign 9 women to produce a baby in 1 month, don't think you're going to get it. If you do, you may not like the way that that was done. And then if you assign 5, say, physiological male people to that problem, then you also probably won't like the way that they produce a baby, regardless of what timeline they produce it with. And the shorter the timeline, the more concerned you should be, right? And then the last point is that there are an irreducible number of errors in complex systems because you're changing them. They are complicated. There's no way you can test all of them. So the point of that is really to get to a point where you feel you have met the where you feel you've gotten to a lowest baseline, and then work from there. Okay. The next thing I look at with my clients is portfolio coverage. So in a very, very basic manual, quick and dirty way, I look at what I have today. What do I cover for whatever value of cover? What's out of scope? What's not yet addressed? And then the total, right? You can do this data collection manually the first time, and you're probably going to, but you're going to start somewhere and focus on making progress, right? So let's get deeper again into what it means to cover an application or host in your system. And to me, at least, coverage falls into kind of like 2 categories, but it mostly comes down to assets or risk addressing controls on the assets, right? So knowing what assets you have that are in scope for your program and what the organization even has is not often easy because asset management tends to be just not amazing process for large enterprises who didn't start in the cloud after like the ability to list all EC2 instances, for example, actually was built in. So if you know your list is even vaguely complete, then amazing. And getting to some level of assurance is going to be challenging. Finding owners for those assets is even more challenging, but that isn't the reason to not do it. Okay. Knowing what controls you're using or targeting is somewhat easier, but knowing if they're effective is going to be the challenge. So initial conversations for establishing the enterprise program is usually focused on what tools different assets are going through and hopefully how those tools tie back to risk. But the idea is that as you have these conversations, you'll one day have the conversation more about what control objectives you have and what tooling you'll use to achieve that if you do the approach correctly. Okay. Defining what it means to cover something sets this criteria that the rest of the team and the organization can understand. And that's good because then it's not just sitting in your brain requiring your constant attention and education. And also that gives you some place, again, to start doing a gap analysis, think about next steps, etc. Lots of people decide that they're going to use maturity models like BSIM or SANS Top 25 or the MITRE ATT&CK framework to inform themselves of what other people consider to be coverage and then measure themselves against those. My general recommendation is you can pick your favorite as long as the target has something that you can do a gap analysis with and consider your situation against. You're making progress, so it's not super important, right? You can change your mind later to change to a more mature model or something that goes with what you're doing better if you decide it's not working for you. But the first step is to pick something at all, get people to agree on it. And what I'll often say to people from a practical perspective is that you should pick your strongest ally or your strongest opponent and pick the framework they want to use, because then you can turn them into an ally because they have incentive to defend their position. You'll likely need to assign somebody to do this, so make sufficient time and allocate someone to do it. Once you've got your basic, manually put together situational awareness on coverage, you can possibly move to some automation, right? This is just Jenkins. You can set up jobs for different phases and activities and possibly write some scripts to just push the last scan status or whatever into some database or dashboard or even just a page on Confluence. And it's still better than manually tracking all of your things in separate places. And the basic automation could allow you to do things like look at coverage in a lot more detail, right? So when things were covered last, not just if they're covered at all. Confirm your assumptions about what is covered and what is not covered, because you've probably made some like, yeah, I think so, but this kind of dashboard will tell you, like, technology doesn't exactly lie. And then you can get notifications when things are failing and spend time doing more of that as you move through the maturity scale. Okay, then you can get into the really fun and detailed definitions of coverage. For my portfolio in Appsec, it's often test coverage or test case coverage, which is the same conversation that the development teams are having. And that's one of the reasons why I also want to have the same conversations, because they're my clients. I want them to be speaking, I want to be speaking their language, and I want to be aligning my goals and objectives with theirs, right? Once you can look at this level, you often get into things like bills of materials and technology and feature sets. So you can try to feed this back into your asset management process to refine what information you have about assets and get deeper into these other aspects of what it means to cover these things from a security perspective. So now, once you have the information, you can really have detailed conversations about supply chain. You can have more detailed conversations about prioritization. And you can have these conversations about business based on like asset characteristics. Do we have any questions so far? Okay, I'm going to continue that. Okay, so let's talk about getting people to do things. Okay, we talk a lot to people about return on investment and action plans, and this is the major point of reporting. Okay, normally the things that you hear people talking about in terms of strategies for getting people to do things is to gamify things, for one, right? So set up competitions, set up comparisons, set up scorecards, and say, hey, your team is doing, X things better than your other peers. You're doing, this better team that we're praising more and doing more for is doing more of this approved activity than you are. So amazing. And then you get things like shaming people into doing a better job. So your team is in the bottom 10 for this enterprise metric, you should do better, right? You can give them rewards and recognition. So things like you guys have more security practices that you're practicing on a regular basis. You're more secure, so you can have more fun projects, more autonomy, more t-shirts. I don't know, something like this, right? And those are great tactics in a lot of ways, but they provide extrinsic motivation. So if you use these stories at a global scale, I suggest you kind of focus more on the rewards and recognition and the gamification, because that appeals in some ways to people's intrinsic motivations, which are things like avoiding pain and looking like an idiot and producing quality products, professional pride, those types of things. If you're in an adversarial relationship, that's going to be a lot of work. So the first story that they're going to really ask you is, what's in it for me? Me being the audience you're reporting to. So the measurements are this slide are useful, but remember the guiding principles and apply them to your stories too, right? You want to help the business control their own destiny. You want to help the business figure out what fundamental security controls are broken and then fix the root cause, right? And then you want to make progress. So how can you use the measurements to tell the story and make progress? Okay, so here's some good stories to tell people that will do probably better at getting other people to do things. Okay. Teams that took this training have fewer of this type of vulnerability, which means in some sense that we bother them less and that they can have their time back to do the things they want to be doing. Okay. Your team keeps making this kind of security mistake. Please make this change to your process and send all of them to this kind of training in this area so they stop making the same mistakes. And then since we implemented this tool set, we found and fixed this number of vulnerabilities or design issues or other things that were causing significant risk that otherwise might have been found by pen testers or external threat actors. And that's up from 1% or 0% before. And this last one, you probably want to tell your boss. And the other ones are for your colleagues in other units, like the dev teams. And the point behind them is that, they have time that they're spending on security with you, right? And you value their time, but you also have objectives as an organization. And so you can throw the word breach around, but really you just don't want to be bothered. Like, let's all do our job. Let's take the easiest path, which is the one that I'm proposing. And that's the story you want to tell them. Okay. The first step in starting out that process is really to have a compliance checklist. Unfortunately, you really do have to do this. A lot of people say to me, like, no, compliance is not security. And like, that's totally correct, right? But we have to do it anyway. So like, get over it. Right? What I would say is that the compliance checklist is nice because it does involve all of the framework pieces that you would probably want in a real program, a real effective security program anyway. So you can sneak all that stuff in, but the point is you have to have the conversation first, right? So you can use the compliance checklist to basically tell the business, hey, look, if we don't do this stuff, we literally cannot do business, right? We can't accept credit cards or we can't something, and that means our clients won't sign and we don't make any money. So like, let's do this thing, right? And then you can use that as an excuse to build out one paved path for compliance that covers off your simple security baseline and use that paved path as a sneaky or not so sneaky path to actual security. The point is that you left yourself an in to have that conversation, and they can agree that you actually need to do something. So now the question is, are we going to do something useful with the effort they're expending anyway, or are you going to do nothing? Right? So the key for this, though, is that you have to be practical as a security person and sure about what your absolute minimum requirement is. And then you can assign people, again, to concentrate on this, negotiate on things in good faith, look at the things that are reasonable, look at the explanations that the other people are giving you, and then operate the program. Right? This is going to be the bulk of your operational work. It just is for the first bit, at least. Right? Once you've got somebody on the overall compliance effort and you're collecting some sort of data on vulnerabilities or other types of code quality issues that you're interested in, then you can stick the data from that into some kind of reasonably accurate tool and then tie those things back and do something like a peer group analysis. If I have no other info, then at least I have some information on how many findings I have per code base and how many apps I'm dealing with, and then hopefully what teams these apps belong to. So I can come up with a quick and dirty average and call it code quality, vulnerabilities per lines of code, right? Then I can go to people and say like, hey, technology people like us are really generally short on time. So as long as somebody is still focusing on, baselining absolute minimum areas, I'm going to focus my attention on the top 3 and bottom 3 in this peer group analysis because they're the clear outliers. And I can focus time on investigating and building out dashboards or other things specifically for them with an eye for reuse and automation later. Right? And so the top 3 in some ways are really obvious for investigation. They probably represent a good portion of the vulnerabilities that you have, and you can build out dashboards and really talk to them about how they can get ahead on their security issues and make you get out of their hair. Right? If security is the enemy, then the extra attention is a little bit like punishment and a reward, right? You get extra attention and help, real help actually, for being poor at security, but it is a very big incentive for them to stop being so bad at it because they don't want you in their face, right? If security is a partner, then the bad code quality probably means that they do need actual help at something and would appreciate it. And in both cases, if you're genuinely trying to help, and at the same time you're making it clear what the help involves, then the framing of the story and how the help is important and the visibility in the spotlight will help generally in improving the situation, right? I would also say that some organizations realize how much transparency like this can be a weapon. And that's why a lot of them are allergic to any kind of measurement. Okay. Another point, I guess, from a peer group analysis is that it might be a good thing if the top 3 offending teams don't represent sort of the significant portion of the issues you're dealing with. That means your organizational target group has somewhat uniform code quality to some degree, and then you can look at some of the other like global things that I'm talking about in a lot more detail and focus time there instead, right? The bottom 3 ones I suggest looking at for different reasons. Either you don't have the tooling to find the issues that you're interested in those technology stacks for the bottom 3, or they're genuinely doing well. If the problem is that you don't have the tooling and they're actually still important, then you should probably work out how you're going to get better results there, right? If they're genuinely doing well, then you should be going back and you should be figuring out rewards. You should be giving them back autonomy. You should be also making a big fuss over how awesome they are. You should let them tell you how it was done and then let them lead others. If you are starting up a security champions or like some kind of self-service or like automation program, these are the guys that are genuinely doing well and can be a target for that. And you can help them just achieve the things they're already achieving just in some kind of auditable way, which I think they can appreciate. Right? As you manage to get more info, you can also pick out top 3 offending applications for different teams as well. And so you narrow the focus a little bit further even for them. If we then look even more at getting people to do things, you can build out a basic dashboard like this. Okay. I'm going to target the teams that have like the highest average defects and target remediation and education to fix, say, the 3 most prevalent issues and the 3 most critical issues to rapidly reduce both noise and risk. So even really, really, really ordinary teams have usually some obligation to give a nod to security. So information like this lets you suggest some action, right? You can probably, based on just the number of vulnerability count, do a back of the paper napkin ROI calculation for them. And then you have the data that you can use to talk to them about smart objectives, right? I have in this example 5 different things because Java deserialization comes up twice. So you have 5 different things that you can educate them on, you can track for them, you can measure overall reduction on, you can tune tooling around, right? You can talk to them about what do they think is a reasonable timeline for actually closing these vulnerabilities and make them stay gone, right? And keep in mind, like you're building, again, the platform or even the concession for security the first couple of times you're doing this. So bring your best negotiating face and then let them sort of stare at this information and then give you what they think is reasonable. And then in the background, you can run the numbers from something like a time and effort estimate to tell the ROS when you project the overall goal will be accomplished. Like you have all these vulnerabilities that you are tracking from an overall baselining perspective, and you have your list of compliance things, right? So if I say each of those things are going to be very similar and we have this projected cadence, is it going to take me 10 years to finish this list? Like, is that reasonable? And then you can go to their boss and be like, hey, so if, based on my assumptions and sort of some calculations, we're going through this list and we're trying to close the vulnerabilities that we've got here. It is going to take you 10 years to get through this list. Is that acceptable? Because like it's your risk and I just want you to be sure that you're comfortable with it. And you're fact telling them things in the way that's utterly transparent because you can show your work, right? And then if they say something like, yeah, no, that doesn't seem very realistic, 10 years? Then you have a basis for negotiation and additional sanity checking and so on. Right? So remember this loop. Now you've watched, you've done problems, you've got some idea of how to talk through objectives and timelines, and you can now hopefully teach and fix based on like 5 things, 2 things, whatever the like a number that is easily digestible, right? And then you have what you have to do. And over time, you should be able to build up dashboards like this, okay, to get more granular about trends. Because as I said, situational awareness is great, but you need to show, but the point is making progress, right? I don't care about today, it's just a number. I want to see good trends. So I want to see that I'm fixing the problem. The trend is going towards completion in the timeline that we agreed on, that things like code quality is going up, that people are training in the target areas that we're interested in, and that the training is sticking, right? That problems are being addressed and they're going away, right? If you can see those trends, then we're in good shape, right? If you're seeing bad trends, then you have a different reason to investigate. Maybe the training isn't useful, right? You're seeing training go up over time, but you're not seeing any reduction, then it's not sticking. Something else has to happen, right? Maybe we should be looking at our tooling. Maybe we should be looking at, something else. The idea is with these dashboards that you can talk to them about objectives, like the objective-based approaches, and say like, hey, we're not actually doing anything. You're still having this problem recur. So let's talk really what we're going to do about it, right? I like talking to you and I want to help you, but I don't like nagging you. And so um, that's the story I actually tell to most people that I talk to is like, nagging is not really an attractive quality in a colleague, so I don't want to do it unless you make me, right? You still want to keep track of things like overall, um, and you want to show them things, but you only want to really measure them against these things. The reason why you want to track things overall and give them similar dashboards about like all the other stuff that you might be finding is like, because once you've eliminated, say, the top 3 noisiest and the top 3 severity vulnerabilities or issues or whatever it is that you're commonly seeing, you're probably going to move on to the next most prevalent and noisy issues to try to get rid of them, right? And so you're giving them a little bit of foreshadowing. And that's good because once they get into the habit of things, you might find that the issue is fixed before you have that conversation with them. If you're looking at campaigns that are more generally applicable across the board, I suggest targeting general activities towards specific categories of findings as the first step. You should do this as the organization is setting baselines, but on a higher maturity scale, you can kind of do this to identify problems that you may be able to fix with things like custom libraries or adopting new frameworks or making different design decisions, right? As you aggregate risk and information on a global scale, you'll get to these kinds of trends and then be able to figure out if you want to spend time on it and how much, right? And so to do this, I suggest you pull, again, whatever data for your portfolio you have into some kind of vulnerability or data aggregation and aggregate against some category. In some ways, again, it doesn't matter what category, as long as the stakeholders can agree to use it. For Appsec, I always use the OWASP top 10 category as the first pass because it's an accepted industry benchmark. And it's mentioned in a lot of compliance frameworks and policies. And then you can look at this again and do the same thing. Ask what are the top and bottom, say 1 or 2 categories, and then run campaigns against it. Right. So for a client, we had things like cross-site scripting come up two years in a row. And so we talked a bit about how they might want to run an overall campaign to close all the vulnerabilities across the board and turn it into a common control, and then apply some remediation across the board because that's cluttering up all their dashboards and taking up all their team time. Usually people can get behind that, and because it makes for a really good story. And there's a clear objective. It's not like fix all the things. It's like this one thing, please. Right? And then the fun thing is things like the next category is Java deserialization as a big category of factors. And so if I look at my team and I say hey, even my team doesn't have a lot of experience or knowledge about this, then that's something that you can maybe target new hires for or target training for your own team as, right? And then you can also look at that and say hey, based on the work that I've done previously, I know what part of the asset management database I should be referring back to because I'm going to target the teams that actually use Java. And in a way, that means I also know maybe what I want to ask my pen testers to find, right? So a couple of caveats around this particular approach is that, not everything falls into an OWASP top 10 category or into any particular categorization. So you have to be really careful not to overlook categories. But I hope you can see why categorization might be useful. Then if you look and you see and your focus on top issues, that tells you a couple of things. It tells you you're good at detecting issue and that there are lots of instances, right? It doesn't give you any information about what you're failing to detect. So if you keep that in mind, then always look at the bottom part of your categorization as well, because that tells you a bit about either the vulnerabilities that you can't detect well or that you don't have tooling for, right? And so those are things for improvement for future years, because you might say, wonder if I just don't have any of that type of vulnerability, or if we're not finding it. And then that might be another thing that you say to your pen testers, like, hey, look for this vulnerability because I want to confirm whether or not it's one case or the other. And then I can do something about that maybe in my next year's program. I think I mentioned that you can look at bills of materials to refine your asset database. So that's something to look at. And then you can apply your skills and interest matrix to assigning people to deal with these types of issues on a more global scale, right? And then when you're selecting your vulnerability and control categories that you're going to focus on as you mature this process, you probably want to look at one that does actually tie back to your compliance and governance requirements. Again, so you have a bit of a rationale that people can sort of nod and get behind. If you use an arbitrary one, then you're going to get more arguments than is necessary for something that isn't actually that important in terms of exactly which one. Okay, I'm going to talk quickly about figuring out how we're doing and what we should do next. So are people using the services that we are offering voluntarily? Why and why not? That's one of the key metrics for software security programs as we move towards security as a service, right? We want to figure out things like bottlenecks, pain points. Are we getting better at delivery? Who's doing well? Who's doing not? And you can do that by just taking data points around SLAs and adoption rate and those types of things, right? If you go back to the guiding principles and you talked and you think, is the business taking control over their own destiny? This is the reason why we ask, are people using the tools and services voluntarily? Because that gives you a good indicator of kind of where they are, right? You can also look at whether or not they're using the tools voluntarily to sort of make a educated guess as to why they're avoiding you. And whether or not that avoidance is improving, right? And that's not an easy thing always to do because, again, some organizations are a little bit allergic to measurement. And so what one of my colleagues did while he was working at an organization where it is a little bit difficult to get direct feedback for various reasons, is he held a couple of communication workshops. So he got a bunch of people together and he said, what communication touch points do we actually use, right? So what is the touch point and what's the medium, right? Is it that people ask us about doing a scan and then they ask by email, right? Do we have vulnerability readout calls and we have meetings, right? Do we reach out by social media? Do we have web pages? Is it a push or pull interaction? And then he asked the participants to rank the communication touch points in their order of perceived frequency. And then he classified that type of touch points into things like reporting updates or education or call to action and those types of things. And we did some analysis on just that information, perceived frequency and some categorization. And then we found that things like, the most frequent touch points were still call to action requests through the central mailbox, and that we did very little education and reporting. And we had almost no requests for help me. Right? And we could also analyze sort of channel usage and then see what the most demand SMEs were. And that's interesting because we can tell where the respective teams have attitudes toward each other and tells you a little bit about how the groups think about like their engagement with one another, right? And so then we can do a little bit even more deeper analysis and can say, okay, how do we reduce, the majority of these touch points that are the most useless ones? This scan for me activities, or like this thing is coming up and I need it yesterday, right? So can we do automation? Can we build things into the pipeline? Can we use vulnerability reduction tactics like the ones I described, right? Is there an over-reliance on email and meetings? If there is, can we diversify the communication channels, right? Do we have a specific reliance on just one person for all of our social media communications with our stakeholder groups? Because if we do, then that person has both a high churn risk because they might get bored, and they have a really high truck value. And by truck value, I mean if, God forbid, this person was hit by a truck tomorrow, how much trouble would your team be in? Right? Then there's also an issue for that individual's career path, because when you have them doing one thing and they're the only ones who do it, how do they get promoted into other jobs? It's not like, generally it doesn't happen. That's why they end up being bored and then they end up leaving, right? And then you can look at the places where it's like high SME touch points, right? And then we can look at that and think like, hey, are there educational activities that we can do in that space to reduce the reliance on SMEs? Can we dump their brain into some kind of repo that can be consumed by other people, right? And then we can check that information, even like these touchy-feely, like perceived frequencies. We can find touch points inside of our actual data to support or dismiss certain points. So I can look at things like scan volume and time allocation towards things like dealing with strategic and planned issues versus firefighting, and figure out whether or not the ScanMe activities really do take up the majority of my time. I can look at close rates. I can look at trainees and courses taken and all those types of things to see whether or not the data we're getting from these touchy-feely like ranking mechanisms are actually panning out in real life. Okay. And then I talked about a bunch of the other things. If you're not meeting your SLAs, then there's obviously a whole bunch of things that you can do to try to figure out what your bottlenecks and pain points are. And you can go back to your effort estimators and adjust the information that you have in there, track your team members against sort of the average and the cadence markers to see if you're getting, say, better at delivery, if you're getting better, people are struggling, how much time it actually takes you to do operational activities, so you close the gap on the high and low estimates to come to more and more realistic measurements. And as I said, I think I covered this then. Then you can do a really better estimate of, do we have enough time? Do we have enough people to deliver? Do we have a return on investment? Did we reduce the time in the way that we said we would reduce them? Right. There's a couple of other measures that you can look at as well. One of them is scan tool accuracy, and this one's a big one. Right. It's hard to do an estimate for scan tooling sometimes, but if you triage, say, if you look at your false positive rates and you say you triage, approximately one finding per minute, then at, 8,000, say, false positives, which was the case for a specific client of ours around there, it takes roughly 18 days to remove them. Then if you look at those 8,000 issues and it takes closer to 5 minutes average each, then that's about 90 days worth of effort. So somewhere between 18 and 90 days is a good sweet spot for trying to find time to reduce this problem, right? So we look at some sets of tools and we say, like, they're just verbose and all of the contenders in this space are pretty similar, but it's sort of a good way of doing some at least initial analysis, for example, to decide if you have time to do a switch and or what time you should spend on making a significant improvement by moving specific, like, say, scan signatures to a different tool, coming up with custom test harnesses, or adding detection of this vulnerability or remediation of this vulnerability or remediation of this issue to a more manual process like code review or QA or another more lighter weight, more integrated kind of solution, right? Something that they can do, that the team who owns the code can do as part of their regular like process without security really being there. Again, letting the business to control their own destiny without removing your detection ability. Okay. And on that note, are there any questions?
There are no questions in the chat, but I had a question.
Yes.
Is there, you had mentioned pain points, and do you find in your experience across projects the same pain points returning again and again?
Yeah.
Like a bad burrito?
I would say in general. I think I mentioned a couple of times, like, especially application security is a people thing, right? And people are, in a lot of ways, very predictable about how they react to certain things. I think we hear a lot from development teams that security has an attitude problem. And I hear that similar thing from security people as well, is like our other technology parts of the organization have a attitude problem. And my general thought is like, seriously, guys, we all need marriage counseling because we are in this together, right? I would say that is the biggest thing, and that's the source of almost everything else. Is we get pressures to do different things in different and sometimes very conflicting priorities and requirements. They don't have to be conflicting, but it is a very difficult thing for people to sort that specific issue out on the operational level. It is a problem that needs to be addressed at an organizational leadership level, and sometimes there's no incentive to do that. And so we do live in that extremely strange reality where that is the case, and we have to know that's the thing, and that some of it won't get resolved. But that is one of the things I see very often, and it's the most pitiable situation that I can find my colleagues in. That is one of the things. And then from a vulnerability perspective, injection is hard, and it's still there. And so we're still doing the cross-site scripting dance like 10 years later, and there isn't a amazing way of fixing that problem. And one of the there are a multitude of reasons for that. I can go on about that for a while.
It's the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, it is. When you think about injection in general, right? We have to make things usable to some degree, right? So when you're putting something out on the internet, you're dealing with the lowest common denominator and the most interesting, motivated, bored people that are sitting there in any part of the world. And so defending anything against that while still making things usable for people who are not super technologically advanced is a very, very, very difficult challenge, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of why it's so hard. So that's my 2 cents on a couple of different very, very commonly recurring issues.
Awesome. Wow. This is having been down the metric, I don't know, merry-go-round, roller coaster, insert Disney ride here. You touched on a number of things that, oh yeah, I remember being down that. So thank you for triggering me.
I apologize.
No, it's good because you could see a situation where, yeah, I'm not the only one that's facing this. It's a common problem. There are approaches to it. So this was excellent in that way. So thank you again, and thank you again for presenting to us. And I look forward to you presenting again, hopefully in person with more stable transport at some time in the future.
Okay, awesome.
All right. Thank you again.
Leave people with the guiding principles and invite you to reach out anytime.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's all we have this evening. So thank you again, and watch our Twitter handle and our Meetup page for announcements for future presentations. We hope to continue with the Elephant Room series in the coming months, as well as other technical presentations. Again, if you're interested in presenting at OWASP Ottawa, look at our Sessionize link, which we share liberally or scattered around the internet. So thank you again, and good night.